У нас нехватка боеприпасов 70%. Shoigu! Gerasimov! Где боеприпасы?
These videos are circulating on Russian social media and are gaining millions of views. This bold, screaming man is the head of the private military company Wagner, and his name is Yevgeny Prigozhin. The mercenaries of this PMC are fighting in Russia's interests against the Ukrainian army, trying to capture the Ukrainian town of Bakhmut. Prigozhin in this speech addresses Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and Chief of General Staff Valery Gerasimov, and he's insulting them. Such behavior is extremely uncharacteristic for the Russian military or political elite. The usual style of Russian generals and officials is not to say too much, not to speak publicly, not to criticize influential people at the top. As we say in Russia, не выносить ссор из избы, not to wash dirty linen in public. That is not to devote extraneous persons to the problems. And this is why Prigozhin's actions and speeches have become a kind of sensation for the Russian political elite and those who follow politics. This has never happened in Russia's modern history. And how is it that this man has defied the usual order? Does his political future await him? Maybe can he and his militants seize power? Or will the Kremlin sharks dispose of him? My name is Dmitry Kolesev. I am a journalist from Russia and now I live in Lithuania. On this channel, I will tell English-speaking viewers about unusual and important phenomena from my country, from Russia. And the first video on this channel is about Yevgeny Prigozhin, maybe the most unusual member of the Russian political elite today. And guys, I apologize for my English, for my pronunciation. It's far from perfect, that's why I'm using prompts on my screen, and I'll be happy to read your corrections in the comments below. Thank you. Yevgeny Prigozhin started out as a petty criminal. In 1980 in Leningrad, now called St. Petersburg, he and his friends robbed a woman in a back alley. They took the woman's gold earrings and her boots and ran away. And it was one of many petty crimes for which he was convicted twice. He was sentenced to 13 years in prison in 1981, but was released earlier in 1990. Soon the USSR collapsed in 1991 and Prigozhin was able to go into business. At first, he sold hot dogs in Leningrad, the first hot dogs in Leningrad, and then his mate from sports school gave him a share in a chain of grocery stores. In 1996, Prigozhin opened his own restaurant, Staraya Tamozhnya, the old customs house, which is still in operation today. It was the restaurant business that helped this former criminal enter the circle of the political elite of first St. Petersburg and then all of Russia. City leaders often came to the chic restaurant and Prigozhin served them personally at the table. So this is how he gained their trust. St. Petersburg is also the hometown of Vladimir Putin. Putin became president in 2000, and in 2001 he hosted French President Jacques Chirac in St. Petersburg, and the official dinner was held at the New Island restaurant, another restaurant which belonged to Prigozhin. He, of course, served food and drinks to the guests in person. In the few publications on Prigozhin's past, there is speculation that maybe he gained Putin's confidence by first befriending his security guard, Viktor Zolotov. Zolotov is still close to Putin and now heads the Rosgvardia, the security force responsible for suppressing political protests in Russia. Anyway, Putin obviously liked Prigozhin's service, and in 2002 he invited American President George Bush to the same restaurant, and then again in 2006. And you know, each time Prigozhin personally served the distinguished guests. Here is a unique photo, 2006. Yevgeny Prigozhin, who would later end up on the FBI wanted list, offers an alcoholic beverage to the United States president. When he first tweeted about this a few months ago, it seemed so unbelievable that Newsweek magazine even did a special study to see if it was true or not. And turns out, true. In Russia, when you get to know the people in power intimately, you have the greatest opportunities to make money, make big money. Perhaps not only in Russia, though. So Prigozhin soon started getting contracts to cater for government events in St. Petersburg and then in Moscow as well. Among other things, he organized banquets for the defense ministry and probably made friends with the generals in charge of supplying the army with food there, and in the future, this will allow him to enter into lucrative contracts to supply food to the armed force of Russia and municipal services to military camps. And this is quite a different kind of money, tens of millions of dollars. And of course, thanks to Russian corruption, it's possible to earn much more than in ordinary business. Another area of income for Prigozhin was school children's nutrition. His companies began supplying school meals to children in St. Petersburg and then in Moscow, and this was often accompanied by different scandals. In Moscow, for example, parents of school children complained of poisonings due to poor quality products, and when opposition politician Lyubov Sobol took up the investigation of these facts, Prigozhin organized kind of surveillance and pressure on her, spending millions of rubles to do so. But if Prigozhin were just a trivial corrupt man, who wouldn't be talking about him now? The two projects that made him most famous before the war in Ukraine were the Troll Factory and the private military company Wagner. Let's talk about it. This building in St. Petersburg housed the so-called Internet Investigation Agency. The independent Russian press dubbed it a troll factory, and the company, which is controlled by Prigozhin, hired hundreds of people to spread misinformation on social networks, to leave different toxic comments and criticize the opposition leaders. Prigozhin trolls first frolicked on the Russian internet and then entered the international arena. In 2016, the Troll Factory tried to intervene in American politics, and you know this story. They purposely stirred up controversy and conflict on social media, spreading conspiracy ideas and misinformation. And for me, it's unlikely that Prigozhin's activities alone could have led to Donald Trump's victory, but it demonstrates well how Vladimir Putin tried to influence American politics with different dirty tricks. In addition to the Troll Factory, Prigozhin created an entire holding company of internet sites that posed as journalists, but in fact engaged in the lowest level propaganda and discrediting of political opponents of the Kremlin. The Russian authorities, they harshly persecuted the real journalists, but Prigozhin's information mercenaries, they could do whatever they wanted. Technically, the Troll Factory was not connected to the government, and when Vladimir Putin was asked about Yevgeny Prigozhin and Troll Factory, he replied that it was just like one of the businessmen he knew a little. But it was obvious that Prigozhin was acting in the interests of the Kremlin, and for Putin it was a very convenient way to hide behind the screen of some private person.
Вы действительно думаете, что человек, который занимается ресторанным бизнесом, имея даже какие-то хакерские возможности, имея какую-то частную фирму в этой сфере, я даже не знаю, чем он там занимается, что он действительно с этих позиций может повлиять на выборы в Соединенных Штатах или в какой-то европейской стране, как же низко пало вот все, что происходит в информационной и политической сфере в странах Объединенного Запада, если ресторатор из России может повлиять на выборы.
Exactly the same principle was used to organize the Wagner PMC. We can assume that Putin or some maybe of his closest associates came up with the idea of creating a private military company when they saw how American companies like Blackwater in fact perform military functions for their governments. But in Russia, the idea of a private military company has been perverted to the extreme. The company was named Wagner, because of the nickname of one of its leaders, a Russian military officer Dmitry Utkin. He holds Nazi views and has taken the call sign Wagner in honor of Hitler's favorite composer, Richard Wagner. Here is a photo, Utkin, at a meeting with Putin, and here is another picture of him with Nazi tattoos. Yes, there are such people in the Russian army, which claims to be fighting the Nazis in Ukraine. But Utkin was only one of the commanders of the private military company, and the main organizational and financial work was done by Yevgeny Prigozhin. Why was Prigozhin entrusted with this particular case? Perhaps because he had good connections in the Ministry of Defense for the organization of food for the troops. Perhaps because he was, the most unscrupulous businessman in Putin's circle. In any case, it was Prigozhin who orchestrated the operation of this structure, which manifested the worst of the Russian state. In 2014, Russia started a war against Ukraine by annexing Crimea and supporting separatists in Donbass. But back then, Putin didn't dare to officially send troops into Ukraine and grossly violate international law. Instead, a private military company was used, which the Russian state had nothing to do with. Under Russian law, mercenarism is a serious crime, so the very existence of the PMCs is legally impossible. But my native country, Russia, is a country of paradoxes, and where the impossible is possible, unfortunately, often in the worst sense. The Wagner PMC offered a lot, by Russian standards, a lot of money to people who had military experience and were willing to risk their lives with weapons in hand. They got their own training camp in southern Russia, and soon the Wagner fighters were actively fighting in Ukraine and in Syria, and then in Libya, Central Africa, and other places. Could such activities be carried out without the supervision of the Russian Defense Ministry and the Russian security services? Definitely not. Was Putin aware of what was going on? Of course, yes. He used the Wagner PMC for dirty military affairs, just as a troll factory for dirty information businesses. Information about Prigozhin leaked to the Russian opposition media, to independent media, but he himself avoided the press and almost never gave interviews. Even his pictures was extremely scarce. This went on until 2022, when Russia started an open, full-scale invasion of Ukraine. As you know, the plan to take Kyiv in 3 days quickly failed, the Russian army was defeated, and Putin's forces suffered one defeat after another. Then the Kremlin decided to call in the Wagner PMC, whose main forces were concentrated in Africa at that moment. By that time, Prigozhin's fighting group had already turned to kind of veritable army, which even had its own aviation. True, the Ukrainians resisted so bravely and effectively that soon Wagner's fighters were defeated. And then Prigozhin negotiated an audacious plan in the Kremlin. He would go to Russian penal colonies, to prisons, and offer the prisoners freedom in exchange for their participation in the war. It sounded like a gamble, but Putin apparently gave the go-ahead and even awarded Prigozhin, with the country's highest military award, giving him the title of Hero of Russia. And Prigozhin personally circled Russian prisons in a helicopter, and he went out to the parade ground in front of the prisoners and offered to let them go free in 6 months if they went to fight in Ukraine.
Далее, через полгода уходите домой, получив помилование. Те, кто хочет остаться с нами, остается с нами. Поэтому вариантов вернуться на зону нет никаких. Те, кто приезжает и в первый день говорит, куда-то я не туда попал, мы делаем отметку дезертир, и после этого следует расстрел.
And this is how tens of thousands of people got out of prisons. Murderers, robbers, drug dealers, and Prigozhin used to be in prison himself. So he spoke the same language with these people and understood what they wanted. And he gave them weapons, promised them good money, and sent them off with machine guns to storm the mighty Ukrainian strongholds, like as Bakhmut.
У вас есть кто-нибудь, кто может вас в 10-й срок отсюда из зоны вытащить? Как вы думаете? Есть двое, кто вытаскивает. Это Аллах и Бог в деревянном ящике. Я вас живых и забираю.
Prigozhin himself began to appear in the press more often. His press service began regularly publishing his statements, photos, and videos. War brings out the worst, and it brought Prigozhin to the surface. A large office of his PMC officially opened in St. Petersburg, and on the streets of Russian cities, there are advertisements urging people to sign up for the Wagner PMC. Prigozhin each time demonstrated that there are no rules for him. Once, one of the prisoners he recruited, Yevgeny Prigozhin, surrendered in Ukraine and then gave an interview to Ukrainian journalists. Prigozhin managed to get him back through the kind of exchanger procedure in some way, and then this prisoner was executed by smashing his head with a sledgehammer, as an example to others. And Prigozhin approved this fact. And those who have served in the Wagner PMC assure in one voice that they regularly use summary executions, although Russia has declared a moratorium on the death penalty. And no one puts Prigozhin in prison for this. The very existence of Prigozhin, his private army, and the methods by which they operate is a symbol that the Russian state has decayed. It has lost its monopoly on violence, and it doesn't respect its own laws. Prisoners for the gravest crimes are set free and given guns in their hands. And Prigozhin, who has broken the law many times, continues to send more mercenaries to Ukraine, as if nothing had happened. But now the storm clouds have begun to gather over Prigozhin as well. In recent months, he has been having a quarrel with the Russian Army Command. He claims that the Defense Ministry has artificially organized a shortage of shells, of ammunition, for the Wagner PMC. Therefore, during the storming of the Ukrainian town of Bakhmut, where the most desperate battles are now taking place, an incredible number of mercenaries are killed. You know, the Russian side does not officially name numbers, but Prigozhin said that other day that the losses amount to tens of thousands. And some believe that, in fact, Prigozhin's army has been wiped out in Bakhmut. Perhaps Prigozhin is telling the truth. Perhaps the Russian military officials are unhappy with the emergence of a bouncy competitor and is trying to weaken its forces by throwing the Wagner PMC into a bloody assault on Bakhmut. Prigozhin is taking desperate steps, publicly calling out Putin and berating Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and Chief of General Staff Valery Gerasimov.
Они пришли сюда добровольцами и умирают за то, чтобы вы жировали в своих кабинетах с красным деревом. Учтите это!
This is such defined behavior that the Russian elite is kind of numb, and some believe that Prigozhin's days are numbered. He has violated all the boundaries of what is acceptable, and he will be killed or imprisoned. Others believe that times in Russia are so crazy now that only people like Prigozhin have a chance to win in the bloody competition within the elite. Could it be that Putin, who is losing the war, will bet on him like a man who is not afraid to call things by their proper names? The Russian elite is corrupt, lazy, and cowardly. It was not ready for war, and it didn't want this war. And it is extremely afraid that Prigozhin will get more power and set up a real tough dictatorship in Russia. After all, he explicitly stated that there are traitors not only at the war front, but also in the bureaucratic offices, and the same methods should be applied to them as to the traitors at the war front. Who knows? What if this scumbag with his own army can seize power if something happens to Putin, or maybe even organize a military coup to overthrow Putin? So far, this sounds fantastic for me, but in today's Russia, it seems that the most improbable things are already possible.